The Capitals have some tough questions in regards to the roster. We'll discuss next on this edition of Locked On Capitals.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals. I'm so glad you decided to join me today. As always, this podcast is free and available on all the major platforms. And I want to thank you for making this your first listen or view of the day. Yes, this podcast is also available in video form, so head on over to YouTube and check it out. My name is Dan Holme. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, we talk about the Bears winning the Calder Cup for the first time since 2010. Later in the show, we will talk about the coaching staff and what that means for the Caps, and then the tough roster questions, and that is where we will start this evening. In today's episode, we are happy to have Gil on the show from the Powerplay Point Podcast. Gil, welcome to the show.
Dan, thanks again for having me once again. Pleasure being on.
It's great to have you back on the show. So the Capitals have some tough questions to answer this offseason, most notably with Evgeny Kuznetsov. But the more I'm hearing now is that he will most likely be back with the team. Same goes for Anthony Mantha. Anthony Mantha is a bit of a tougher case because everyone can see the back of his hockey card. They know that he didn't have a really good season last season, and they also see that the Capitals owe him quite a bit of money. So I don't think that there's going to be a lot of takers for him. Just taking a look at, let's start with Mantha in particular. What do you think the Capitals should do with him? For me, I think that unless they can find a good fit for him somewhere else, someone that's going to be willing to take that contract off the books, I think they're just going to have to view him as a depth piece.
Well, unfortunately, that's probably going to end up being the reality. If they could find a way to make the buyout option work under the current rules, which it's a bit complicated, of course. The buyout applies over 2 years, and you only save a certain amount. If they could find a way to make that work, I think I would rather do that because the Caps do have some up and coming young talent. Then unfortunately, Mantha is just taking up a roster space, taking away from that. But I think you're right, Dan. Unfortunately, the reality of the situation is going to be that he's going to be a depth piece, and he may even be, have to consider himself lucky to get into the majority of the games this season.
And just taking a look at his contract here, he has 1 year left at $5.7 million and will be a UFA next July. So I think that's kind of the position that the Caps were in. The only thing I think that they could possibly do is, if you remember, when the Caps got Craig Smith, when Orlov and Hathaway went out to Boston, was I think that Boston pretty much said, we'll do this trade with you, but you got to take Craig Smith's contract off the books. I think it's kind of the same thing with Anthony Mantha. If they can orchestrate something on July 1st where they're willing to, make a trade or something like that, then I think that there's a possibility that could be the case. The other interesting player is Evgeny Kuznetsov, another player that didn't necessarily thrive, shall we say, under Peter Laviolette's systems. But I've kind of had a bit of a change of tune in Evgeny Kuznetsov. My feelings before were, if he wants out of DC, don't let the door hit you on the butt on the way out. But it seems like there was a disconnect between Kuzi and Laviolette, that maybe that Spencer Carbery could at least potentially be the one to jumpstart his career. Where do you stand with Evgeny Kuznetsov? Do you think that Spencer Carbery could get him going again? Just thinking about it, a couple years ago, he was in the top 3 in goals with the Capitals and drafted rather high. These guys don't necessarily grow on trees. And, the one thing I would hate to see is him move out to another team and just totally kill it. Where do you stand with Kuznetsov?
Well, all along I've been hoping that there would be some sort of reconciliation, as it were, because even though he hasn't shown it very recently, valuable to this team. He still has a lot of worth. And he signed that contract, that high value contract, for a reason. And he showed what he can do in the 2018 Cup year. So I've always been a fan of his, and hoping that the team can find a way to make best use of his talents. I think with the new coaching regime, I think that gives us some excitement, maybe that he'll be, shall we say, better used, not to point fingers, but maybe that was the problem all along, not only with Kuznetsov, but maybe perhaps even Mantha and some other players as well, from what I'm hearing. So I'm kind of glad that we're kind of drifting towards that direction. But at the same time, if there is a deal that comes out of wherever that makes the most sense for the team long term, then I don't see how you can ignore that.
Yeah, and if that deal comes along, that's the big thing. I wish it would, but for me, I wish they would just give Kuznetsov one more crack at it, unless he says something where he's like, "I want out of here." Then I guess I would let him out of here if there's a deal to be made. The other couple players that I'm going to mention here are a little bit more difficult. We take a look at Backstrom and Oshie, both players on the decline, both on the wrong side of 30. And part of my problem with those players, of course, is that they're not getting the production that they used to. But also, even if you wanted to trade, some people are like, well, what's a crazy trade you would make? I think they could get crazy and trade Oshie or Backstrom. And to them, I'd say that's fine, but their value is already so far diminished. Everyone else can see the back of Backstrom's hockey card. Everyone else can see the back of Oshie's hockey card that, he's injury prone. Backstrom had the hip resurfacing procedure done, and he's not the Nick Backstrom of, yesteryear. Did the Capitals hold on to Backstrom and Oshie for too long, or do you still see some value with them on this Capitals team?
Well, there is still some value now. Unfortunately, the contract term, maybe not. Well, in Backstrom's case, perhaps the money, but the term, I think, is what's mm, the downside, is, if you can put it that way, for both of these players. But they do still have some worth. I think if they can find a way, the new coaching staff finds a way to perhaps reduce their 5-on-5 minutes and leave them both available for power play duty. Maybe first or second unit, doesn't really matter, but they are still both very effective on the power play. And I'm excited as to what Coach Carbery can do with the power play. And I think one of those moves he should make should be resting those two and making them still key components on the power play. Other than that, yeah, obviously their value is diminished, unfortunately, but I still think they have a role to play, at least in the very short term. But not unlike Kuznetsov, if the right deal comes along, then it's hard to say no.
Yeah, and Brian McClellan's had a bit of a change of tune. At the end of this last season here, they said that, well, the decision's going to be up to Backstrom if he wants to return. And, I haven't seen a real favorable return. He's kind of backstepped those comments, saying that, he's progressing rather well. But the interesting thing is that they're paying Nick Backstrom a substantial amount of money. Where is he going to fit into this lineup? Is he going to be a third line center? It seems like Dylan Strome kind of has that lockdown on the top line. We've also seen there's Kuznetsov and there's Nick Dowd out there. So ultimately, where is he going to fit in? I mean, it's just kind of a tough position for them to be in, being that he's, Alex Ovechkin's right-hand man, if you will. He has assisted on more Alex Ovechkin goals than anyone else. So it's going to be a tough thing for the Capitals to have to answer. All right, so coming up here, we will talk about the Capitals coaching staff and ultimately, what will it mean for this team? We'll talk about that straight ahead. Baseball season is in full swing, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/locked-on to join today. And if you're watching a game, sometimes it makes it a little bit more exciting if you have some money on the game. That is why you need to go. So check it out. So don't miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/locked-on to sign up. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make sure and subscribe or follow Locked On Capitals wherever you find your podcast and on YouTube. I have a lot of great guests lined up for you this summer, like Gil in this episode here. So make sure and follow or subscribe to Locked On Capitals today. All right, in this next segment here, we are going to talk about the coaching staff for the Capitals. As we know that Peter Laviolette didn't get the result. The Capitals did not get the result that they were looking for. Was it the right thing to do to part ways with Peter Laviolette? I guess that, is open to interpretation, but this was the first time that they missed the playoffs in quite some time, 2014, if memory serves. So the writing was on the walls, but then you asked yourself the questions about Laviolette. There was the myriad of injuries. There was COVID. He is, holds all kinds of records as far as being the winningest U.S. born coach, and has the third most wins of active coaches. So he does have a great track record. So they did cut ties with Peter Laviolette, and they've moved on to Spencer Carbery, who was running the power play up in Toronto, number 2 power play in all of the NHL. Quite an accolade if you think about it. And then they also went out and hired Mitch Love to run the defense. So everything that you've heard around Carbery, and there's not a whole lot that I've heard about Mitch Love so far, except that he was the head coach of the Calgary AHL affiliate Wranglers and had them finish the second place in the regular season standings there. Where are you on the Capitals coaching staff? Do you feel optimistic going into this next season, or do you think that they should have given Peter Laviolette another opportunity?
Oh, I couldn't be more excited about their choices in especially the head coach. But I like you. I've heard a lot of good things about Mitch Love. His record in the AHL does speak for itself. I'm excited as far as what he can do with the defensive core, which got significantly younger in the past month with Sandin and Alexeyev. Hopefully, not hopefully, they're going to be de facto regulars. So I'm excited as to what he can do. But I think the power play has needed an overhaul for quite some time. And with the departure of both not only Laviolette but Forsyth, they're going to get that in Carbery. And I think you're going to see a very positive and significant improvement there. I'm not sure what Alex Ovechkin's numbers are going to look like, but I think I think the fans will be a lot more they'll be pleased with the effort, shall we say. I think the power play at times looked stagnant last year, to be blunt, and you're not going to see that this year. You're going to see a much more active power play. You're hopefully going to see a lot more shooting, but between that and hopefully the improved 5-on-5 play, and not to jump the topic a bit, but maybe some of the younger guys getting a chance this offseason in the upcoming training camp, I'm going to see a different look from the Caps, and it's going to be an exciting team to watch, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the case too. And the thing that I'm excited about is that he has that familiarity with a lot of the youth in the Capitals organization. Connor McMichael, he was the coach for the Hershey Bears. He was the coach for the ECHL Stingrays. He has that rapport there that maybe this could, finally be the season that we start to see some of these younger players integrated into the lineup. The one thing I know about Spencer Carbery is he's a very intense looking guy. When I'm doing thumbnails for this show, every picture I see, there's veins sticking out of his neck or out of his forehead or his jaws clenched. He brings all sorts of intensity, and that's the same thing that I've heard about Mitch Love as well, that in his playing days, he was a pest. He was an instigator, kind of a tough guy. So I think there's definitely going to be some snarl in the locker room. If it's not coming from the players, it's going to come from the coaching staff. But it is exciting that we are finally going to see that change that I think that a lot of Capitals fans were looking for, because let's face it, the same thing was said about Barry Trotz as well, that, there was this reluctance for him to want to play young players. And the same kind of thing has been leveled against Peter Laviolette. He's kind of rebutted some of that and said, maybe you weren't too familiar with the players I had in Nashville. There were a lot of young players I just wasn't necessarily too pleased with the young players in the Capitals organization. Some of the things that I think have changed between Peter Laviolette and Spencer Carbery is that with Peter Laviolette, there was a mandate to win another cup. With this 2018 Rock the Red era, they wanted to squeeze as much juice out of that orange as they possibly can. I think that mandate has changed. In fact, I know it has with Spencer Carbery, where, of course, the above all end all is to win a Stanley Cup. But also, there is a mandate to finally bring along some of these young players that we've heard about for years. See Connor McMichael, see Hendrik Slop here, that kind of thing. Is that one of the things that has you excited about Spencer Carbery? Is that his willingness, ostensibly to work with the younger players?
Oh, most definitely. And like you said, Dan, he does have that rapport, that relationship already in place with a lot of the Calder Cup winning Hershey roster that's there still. And so I think he will find a way to weave into that youth, that younger blood into the lineup and make it, an effective and integral part of the team. Um, I the other thing I'm most excited about is the fact that it just feels like Carberry is more in tune with the way the game is played now. Again, not to knock Laviolette too much, but I think, you know when you think that when you say the phrase that he's kind of rooted in his old ways, it wasn't just that he relied on the veterans. I think his strategy overall tended to be, well, shall we say, a bit outdated for the way the game is played today. I think it would have been more suitable had this, if this was more like 10 years ago, which is closer when he last won the cup. That was his mindset. That was his approach to every game, and I think that was part of why the success just wasn't there his last 2 years.
So it'll be interesting to see what Laviolette is able to do with the Rangers. I wish him nothing but the best at the end of the day. I think that he did his level best with the Capitals at the end of the day. I think he lost the locker room with certain players, like I said about Kuznetsov, about Mantha, and I've heard even some things about Dmitry Orlov as well. So change is what the Capitals fans want, and change they shall get. All right, coming up here, we will talk about the Hershey Bears as they win the Calder Cup. Yes, the Capitals did not get the result that they were looking for, but the Bears did. And we'll talk about that coming up. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. In today's episode, we have Gil on the show from the Powerplay Point Podcast. So, taking a look at the Hershey Bears winning that Calder Cup, it really defied a lot of odds because one of the things that we know about it is that the road team lost every single game except for game 7. Wasn't that something? It was one of the games that I stayed up late and I told myself, Dan, you should go to bed. You got to be up. But this is game 7. Are you kidding me? So I stayed up, and guess what? It went to overtime. Ugh, have you ever seen that Seinfeld episode where night guy screws day guy? It was definitely that case. But they ended up picking up the big win, and that was what was exciting. What was it in that final game 7 that they were able to turn the switch and pick up that big win? Because they were down 2-0 in that game, and they really rallied the troops and picked up a big dub when they really needed it.
I think it's just the inherent leadership on the team. Dylan McElrath, Mike Vecchione, of course, who scored the winning goal. They just it's kind of funny because it was the approach and the attitude was complete 180 from 10 minutes into game 6, where they took the 2-0 lead, and then everything just completely fell apart after that. This time they found a way to keep it together, and got to credit, of course, Coach Todd Nelson, but the internal leadership on the team and the play of, I think, Riley Sutter and Connor McMichael, I think, is what put them over the top. And of course, Hunter Shepard was lights out in goal. So.
Yeah, and there's a lot of outstanding players. You mentioned Ethan Frank, who led the team with, I want to say, 30 goals. But what kind of disappeared a little bit in the playoffs and was able to refine his way again, kind of an interesting player. We saw what he did in the AHL All-Star game, also was like the fastest skater. So I think that they have, at least in the future, a really great option there. I don't know if he's going to be ready for next year, but potentially. But the big thing was that they were able to win the Calder Cup for the first time since 2010, and it was their 12th win, their 12th Calder Cup victory. It kind of broke an AHL record. So that is quite an accomplishment. How excited were you about that? And how excited are you about the possibility about what that means for some really great promotions, at least potentially for some of those Bears players?
Well, I love the fact that Hershey won yet another cup. That's a team and a city rich in hockey tradition. Maybe the AHL doesn't get enough love and eyes on it enough times. I'm hoping that this Calder Cup win kind of brings it. And admittedly, I'm part of that, but I hope this Calder Cup win, very recently happening, changes that. I do think this will open a lot of doors for some guys on that team. I mentioned a couple already. Hunter Shepard may end up being a third goalie, um, although I think he deserves a better fate than that. Connor McMichael deserves another shot, although, as we discussed earlier in the episode, there's something of a logjam at the center position. They're going to have to figure out what they're doing there, because I think the center position is where he belongs and thrives, is what he showed all throughout the playoffs. Hendrix Lapierre definitely deserves a look. Riley Sutter deserves a look. I think he will definitely be a shoe-in with another teammate, Beck Malenstein, on a newly rebuilt fourth line. They definitely deserve to have at least bottom 6 minutes, the both of them. Off the top of my head, that's just a handful of guys who should at least get a look come training camp, maybe in the middle of the year. Maybe a guy like an Ethan Frank, as you mentioned, or a Logan Day might also get a look. So lot to like there, a lot to see or worth looking at coming up in the year.
And some big questions you brought up. Hunter Shepard, who is an unrestricted free agent, won the MVP, was number 2 in all of the AHL. And, here's my whole thought process on it is that Charlie Lindgren is a good backup goalie. Is he a great backup goalie? I think that might be a bit of a stretch. I think the Capitals should view Charlie Lindgren more as an asset, potentially if there's a team that wanted to trade, because what are you going to do with Hunter Shepard? Zach Fucale is going over to the KHL, and I think that he kind of is too good for the AHL. I hate to say it. I know Braden Holtby one time said that the line between the NHL and the AHL is razor fine, and I get that, but if there is a guy that is ready for his opportunity, I think it's Hunter Shepard. I don't want them to squander this opportunity and find out that, he got signed to an NHL team somewhere else. And the whole time going, dang it, I knew we had him. What should the Capitals do with Hunter Shepard? Do you think he would be a viable number 2?
I do. That would be a great way to break him into the the day-to-day struggles, as it were, of playing in an NHL game. They say it is uh, quite a bit faster and takes some adjusting. I think Hunter Shepard's been around long enough that the transition won't take as long for someone like him. I think they need to take a very long look at him, given what he's done very recently. Um, I don't want to say that I've never been a Charlie Lindgren fan. It's more like I don't understand the hate that Darcy Kemper gets sometimes, and I think they see a lot of fans see Lindgren as more deserving. I'm with you, Dan. I don't think he's all that great of a backup. He might thrive in a starting role with another team. Who knows? But I yeah, I can see them maybe packaging him in a deal and opening the door for Hunter Shepard. That might be an option. Maybe not this year, but certainly within the coming seasons.
Because the one thing I know is that the Hershey Bears have a plethora of options: Mitchell Gibson and Garen Bjorklund and Clay Stevenson, and there's Wall down in the ECHL Stingray. So there is plenty of opportunity, and there's plenty, potential goalies that could slot in there. But that would be a real bummer for me if the Capitals lost Fucale, which we know he's going to the KHL, and say someone scoops up Hunter Shepard. He is an unrestricted free agent. There's no restriction there. So, I mean, he can leave, and that's fine. That cannot happen. That is my belief on that anyway. So then the other players, like we talked about, that, I think are due for their big break. This is going to be the big year for Connor McMichael. They need to be all in on him, just because we saw what he did down with the Hershey Bears, and just a guy that is mature beyond his years. Some of these young guys, they get called up and they're all ready to buy their Lamborghini and their big house and, live that NHL lifestyle. But he got called up and was a healthy scratch for quite a few games, and then was sent down to Hershey. Had the right kind of attitude. He said, I'm all putting that in the rearview mirror, and I'm going to concentrate on the task at hand. And that was with the Hershey Bears, and just killed it down there. Is that your assessment, that this has got to be the year for Connor McMichael? The problem, however, is like you referenced earlier, where does he fit? Who's coming out of the lineup? I don't want him playing wing. I don't want him getting relegated to the fourth line. How do we make this happen?
Well, to answer the first part of the question, obviously, yes, this is make or break year for Connor McMichael. And to push the argument further, and it's killing me to say this, but they may want to see about maybe finding a deal, if not for Kuznetsov, then perhaps for McMichael, to get something, because like you said, with Hunter Shepard, you don't want to waste that talent. You don't want to waste that asset. You have something in your hand, but if you cannot find a slot for someone who is ready right now, then all you're doing is just wait. Last year, you could argue, was a wasted year for Connor McMichael. I don't want him to go through that again this year. But if they can't figure out what they're doing with the center position with so many guys, on the depth chart, you have to make a move. Now, that will probably force Brian McClellan's hand to move a Kuznetsov maybe in the long term. But one way or another, you have to find a way, whether it's on this team or not, to get Connor McMichael some playing time. He's proven that he's more than deserving of that.
Yeah, some tough questions lie ahead for Brian McClellan. It's going to be an interesting offseason, I think, is suffices to say. Listen, Gil, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals. Where can we find your work online?
Well, we're called the Powerplay Point Podcast. We're taking something of a bit of an off-season break, but we're going to actually going to record next week after the draft. Going to cover the goings-on for the Caps in the draft, and then the week after that for free agency. You can find us just about everywhere podcasts are distributed. Podbean is our main distributor, but we're everywhere. We can be streamed on Spotify, all the major streaming services, Apple Podcasts, of course. Stitcher, and all the major distributors. You can find us pretty much anywhere. And if you have any questions about where to find us, I'm going to give out my personal email. It's glhallowed@yahoo.com. Have any questions about the show? If you want to be on the show, you're a fan that wants to talk about the Caps on the show, we have an open door policy. Come on whenever you'd like. So contact me there and let me know what you want.
Sounds great, Gil, and we look forward to that. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Locked On Capitals. And are you a fan of other DC sports? Well, Locked On has got you covered. We have Locked On Nationals, Commanders, and Wizards. So no matter what major DC sport there is out there, Locked On has got you covered. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Dan Holme, and I'll talk to you again next time.